So I should just jump in?
Actually, I'm going to do an introduction, if that's cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Kenlei Cowell, and I'm a Global Connections Advisor here at the University of Oregon, working in Tyson Hall. I am so honored to be the host for today because we just have a really exciting panel of really powerful young women who have done some interesting research. This panel session, poster session, is called Influencers. So what I'm seeing that is that this afternoon, we're going to hear 5 very different narratives about a similar theme, though, about how identity influences our perception of media, of history, of all of these different topics that our presenters will talk about today. So I just want us all to hear what hear what the presenters have to say, but then take a minute to think about the identity play going on there. So just as a reminder, each presentation will be 3 to 5 minutes long. So we ask that all attendees be respectful of the presenters and be sure to mute yourselves so that the visual and verbal spotlight is on the student presenting. However, if anyone has any questions at any time, feel free to post them in the chat as a Q&A so that the presenters can answer them when they have time to read them or at the end of their session. After each presenter has a chance to go and do their own mini Q&A, we'll open up the floor for a full Q&A where attendees can ask our presenters individual questions or group questions panel style. So, any questions about that? I see we have a couple attendees that have hopped in as well. So, first up, we have Brenna Barton, a senior in the Clark Honors College, majoring in Romance languages and concentrating in both Spanish and French. Brenna has been working on an exciting project under the supervision of history faculty, Dr. Julie Weiss. And today she will be presenting her findings from her project titled Analyzing Letters to sorry, my Spanish is not great, La Pirenaica as a migrant narrative. I apologize for that pronunciation. I was a Chinese major in school, so without further ado, Brenna, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my poster via share screen. Is this visible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So hi, everybody. I'm really excited to present today on my research project about migrants, global migrations, specifically in the decade of the 1960s. So some context before we jump in here. I'm talking about Spain from the period of about 1939 to 1975, which was during the dictatorship of General Francisco Franco, who was known for bringing a military fascist dictatorship to Spain, which involved political repression, imprisonment of political enemies, poverty, lack of education. So things were bad if you were an ordinary Spaniard who wasn't allied with the regime. And I'm looking at the experience of people who were forced to emigrate out of Spain due to Franco's regime and due to economic considerations as well. And I'm doing all this research based on a wonderful archive of letters that I found while I was working with Dr. Julie Weiss over the summer. And she actually traveled to the archive where this collection of letters was held, and she came back with a collection of them and we worked with them together. So that's where my source comes from. So what you need to know about these letters is that they were written to this radio station called Pirenaica, which was a communist-run radio station actually that broadcasted in secret to avoid the censorship of Franco's regime. So these letters were all written in as part of almost a call-in radio show. Although this happened in the 1960s and it obviously wasn't possible to call into the radio station, the station broadcasted a request to its listeners to send in letters. And it specifically had a program that focused on listeners who were living outside of Spain and asked them to send in letters and explain things like what their work situation was like, their political beliefs, their family situation, really anything they wanted to talk about that could potentially be read on air to the audience of this station. And the audience of this radio station was an audience of migrants. So everyone had that in common, and that helped them create this community as they listened to each other's stories over the airwaves. So for my research, The methods essentially was that I would look at scanned copies of these letters, like the two examples that appear in the middle of the screen. Due to the pandemic, I wasn't able to go to Madrid and work with the actual physical letters themselves, and they don't exist in an online format. So unfortunately, I did only have these scans to work with. And the quality of these scans, I know it's really small, I'm very sorry about that, but you might be able to tell that the handwriting and the scanning quality differs quite a bit between the letters. So some of them were a little bit more difficult to read and decipher, particularly because they are written in the original Spanish of the migrants who wrote them, most of whom tended to not have much higher than a middle school equivalent education. So one of my criterion when sorting which letters I would work with for this project was just which letters I could actually read and understand. Out of around 200 letters that Dr. Weiss brought back from Madrid, I wound up working with 25 for this project. And this project, by the way, became my senior thesis. So what I did with these letters, once I had chosen which ones I was going to analyze, read through them carefully, created English translations because not a lot of scholarship exists on this particular subject in English. So part of my goals for this project was to produce scholarship in English that was accessible to an American English-speaking audience. And I then categorized my findings in the letters and tried to pull out general themes and try to figure out really what the experience of these men and a few women, but mostly male authors was. So a couple of examples here in the center of the screen can show you a couple of the broad themes that I found in my research. The first example here, I've quoted from this letter because this letter describes kind of a shocking situation that this man encountered. He emigrated to France to find work because he couldn't afford to work in Spain. When he got there, he was undocumented. He had sort of come into the country illegally. He'd come in as a tourist and overstayed his visa. And because of that, the boss at the estate he worked at took advantage of him. In fact, he said, the letter writer says, well, I had a nice room, but the foreman made me sleep in a pigsty. When I go up or down, all of my clothes get stained, and all of this happens because in Spain, the government does not give us a chance to work. So this particular immigrant talks about his experience being exploited in his workplace due to being undocumented, and how his experience in France was poor and how he blamed the Spanish government for that. The next letter speaks to a different theme that I found in my work, or in my research, that was not discussion of work, but discussion of community. A lot of migrants felt a strong connection to the radio station because it was their only opportunity to hear news from home and to hear stories from people that were experiencing the same thing as them. So this migrant speaks to his motivations for leaving in his letter, as well as requesting explicitly that the station broadcast what he's written in his letter as a form of advice for other migrants that might wish to come to France. He wanted to illuminate them and let them know that really things were also difficult in France, because there was sort of this perception that I found among these letter writers that before they came to France to escape Spain, they thought that things would be a lot better. And what they realized was that they were similarly exploited, similarly poor in many cases. So essentially the why I'm working with these letters is because I'd like to contribute to a genre of history known as migrant narrative. This is a term I'm using from the UC Davis's Global Migration Center, but that term is not exclusive to the Global Migration Center. And migrant narrative is just history about migration told from the perspective of people that experience that migration. So I'm using the content of these letters to develop the migrant experience within this migratory wave in the 60s, and to try and draw conclusions about what these people's life was like, because it would have been almost impossible to find accounts like these in a regular history book focusing on data and big picture. Before I wrap up here quickly, I'd just like to acknowledge Dr. Weiss and of course the DPRI Fellowship for helping me make this research possible. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. And thank you to Dr. Weiss for helping me with that. And also thank you to helping me with my pronunciation. I'm very grateful I even practiced, but you taught me a lot with that. And just on this topic, before we move on, are there any direct follow-up questions that we have? If you do, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourselves. Okay, so if there aren't any questions at this time, feel free to save them for later, but we are going to move to our next speaker. So next we have Sammy DiMinno. Sammy is a major in journalism with a minor in Spanish. Throughout her time at the UO, Sammy participated in Duck TV Sports, Camp Kesem, and the School of Journalism and Communications Track Bureau. She has been working with the SOJC faculty, Professors Lori Shantz, and Professor Julianne Newton on her exciting research, which is titled Pregnant Female Athletes and How They Are Framed in the Media. The floor is yours, Sammy.
All right, I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right. Okay. Can everyone see this? Yes. All right, awesome. Okay, so my name is, my name is Sammy, and I'm presenting on how the media frames pregnant female athletes. And for this project, I chose this particular topic because I listened to a podcast last year about how athletes got their contracts reduced because of their pregnancy. So they had to take time off of sports and their respective athletics to have their child. And in that time, their contracts were halted. They didn't get paid for the time they spent off, even though some of them were still doing advertisements for specific companies. So I thought it would be really interesting to look at how the media frames them specifically. So the purpose of my research is to examine how female athletes are framed in the media regarding both their pregnancy and their motherhood. And when talking about framing, it's important to understand that the media plays an important role in framing women's sport, and how the media covers them has an impact on the way the public views them. So for this project for the School of Journalism and Communication, I conducted a limited case study analyzing 4 female athletes, which were Serena Williams, Alicia Montano, Joy Fawcett, and Candace Parker. These athletes were chosen because of their high profile, they're very successful, and they all became pregnant during the peak of their careers. They also returned to the sport post-pregnancy and continued making career achievements. For these athletes, I looked at a 3-year time span, which included the year before their pregnancy, the year during their pregnancy, and the year after, to encompass a part of their motherhood and the return to their respective sport as well. Regarding the outlets I chose 2 main news media outlets, including the New York Times and the Associated Press. And for sports outlets, I chose Sports Illustrated, ESPN, and ESPNW. These were also chosen based off their high production of content and their popularity amongst viewers. I aimed to answer 3 research questions, which included what the common themes and frames in the media are when referring to pregnant female athletes, if there are differences in the framing of these athletes based on the type of publication, whether that be news media or sports media or specialty sports. And then another one regarding race, how are pregnant Black female athletes framed within the media as well? My findings indicated that there were 4 common frames, which included the trailblazer. This was basically an example athlete. If Serena Williams, for example, could go back to and win another Grand Slam, then other athletes can do it as well. They're more as the woman as the leader and the feminist kind of perspective. There was also a competitive athlete frame. They framed the pregnancy as something, another obstacle the athlete will overcome and that they will train to overcome it. Another was the reality frame. This had to deal with specific complications that happened during pregnancy or post-pregnancy that the athlete might have gone through. The last one I found was the superwoman frame. This was found has a very stereotypical, you go girl, you can do anything type frame, where the athlete was praised for balancing motherhood and athletics. Regarding race, a lot of the articles that I read included a lot of complications and injuries, since Black women are more likely to have pregnancy-related complications and are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women are. So a lot of those articles focused on their complications and what had happened in their specific experience. There is also some frames for individual athletes and team athletes as well. Team athletes are depended a lot more than individual athletes. So for example, Joy Fawcett and Candace Parker had to leave their team in order to have their child, and they were framed as, oh, they can't carry the team anymore. They can't have the team on their back. They had to step away and then return, and were therefore criticized for when they chose to have their child, which should be the opposite of when the mother should choose to when they have their child and when they return to their sport for what is right for her. For future directions, there is still a fight for equality in sports, and the media should continue to fight for their pregnant athletes and their representation. And another possibility would be to include athletes who have female partners as well, since I only looked at athletes who are heterosexual and married to men. So, and I would like to thank my advisor, Professor Shantz, and Julianne Newton for helping me with this project.
Fabulous. Any questions for Sammy? I do have a couple clarifying questions that I just want to ask really quickly. For those of us who aren't very well versed in sports, could you remind us what sports each of these athletes play?
Oh my gosh, of course. Serena Williams plays tennis. Candace Parker plays basketball. And Joy Fawcett played on the women's national soccer team. And Alicia Montano is a really famous track athlete who ran a race pregnant in the 800 meters, I think. But yeah.
Wow. And then you also used some language, talking about the superwoman stereotype. And I was wondering if you had any findings about really, what are the effects of having a stereotype like that. That's a positive stereotype, but it's still a stereotype. Did you have any findings?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think a lot of those frames were relatively positive, but when you're talking about something that's, they framed it as more of, oh, this is so exciting, this is so like life-changing kind of, when it should be maybe something more common, that maybe in like future articles, this wouldn't be such a thing that they could be like, wow, she did this, or this is so shocking. Like it could be something that's more common, I think is something that the future media can look into.
Well, thank you. Any other questions for Sammy before we move on? Okay. Questions can always come later, so stay tuned, Sammy. But if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can move on to our next speaker. So next we have Anna Nguyen, a junior double majoring in both political science and economics. Anna is also a Clark Honors College student and is currently involved in the UO Vietnamese Student Association and the UO Economics Club. Anna has been working with her faculty mentor, Dr. Joe Landes from the Department of Political Science, to put together her research titled Exploring the Political and Cultural Underpinnings of Vietnamese American Conservatism. Anna, we're excited to hear about your research.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen really quickly. Okay. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Sorry, I think this was the video. Sorry, let me pull up the PowerPoint. Yes.
And let us know if you need any support too. I did promise all of our panelists that I would perform waiting music. I'm not very musically gifted, so just imagine like some positive thinking music for right now. Also, I do want to note that some of our attendees are our faculty mentors. So while we wait for everything to kind of get tuned up on the screen sharing side of things, thank you for all of the faculty who've been helping these wonderful students, but also coming to the presentations. I think that's just really cool of you, and it's kind of like the full circle.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Okay. Let me try that one more time. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello, my name is Anna, and I'm going to be talking about the political and cultural underpinnings of Vietnamese American conservatism today. And so this project started at the beginning of the year after the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. And as you can see in this picture, there were a number of Vietnamese Americans present at this insurrection. And there were, after seeing the South Vietnamese flag being waved, I wanted to understand why these individuals were there and understand the development of like Vietnamese American conservatism as a phenomenon in the United States. And this is important because longstanding assumptions of Asian Americans as a political and ethnic monolith hinder critical analyses of Vietnamese Americans and their this demographic as like a powerful voting bloc, I guess. And so my research boils down to two important questions. The first being, how did the Vietnamese American conservative movement develop during the post-war diaspora? And what does this worldview look like today? In terms of methods, I was able to reach out to 3 prominent members of the Vietnamese American community. I interviewed them to understand their own cultural backgrounds and how that contributed to the development of their political views. I spoke to an economist and 2 state representatives. In terms of secondary sources, I found it a little bit difficult to find existing scholarship on right-wing conservatism and the Vietnamese Catholic experience. And so I decided to find like relevant material and extrapolate my findings from there. The political motivations of Vietnamese American conservatism stems from experiences of displacement and intergenerational trauma after the Vietnam War, specifically with the fall of Saigon in April 1975. And so refugees in the Vietnamese diaspora carried the resentment that they held with the fall of Saigon with them as they resettled in America. And they were able to connect with others who held the same views. And these traumatic war experiences contributed to kind of a conservatism that developed from more of a robust adherence to South Vietnam as a national homeland, in addition to the values of American democracy itself. On the other hand, Confucian philosophy is also a really important part of Vietnamese society and emphasizes values of respect, obedience, and a deference to political and familial authority. And as a result, religious traditions with similar philosophies, particularly Roman Catholicism, have a significant impact on the depth and spread of conservative values in this community. And Vietnamese American conservatism today looks a lot different than it did a few decades ago when refugees in the diaspora immigrated to America. The complex intersection between like anti-communism, cultural stoicism induced by like Confucian philosophy and the impact that it had on the Vietnamese family structure, and also intergenerational trauma in the post-war diaspora, illustrate how like Vietnamese Catholics in particular found Donald Trump as a very appealing leader in devotion to like very controversial and polemic national leaders like Trump, illustrates how these kind of patriarchal family dynamics and a deference to religious authority intersects with the development of conservatism. But in terms of like the future of Vietnamese American conservatism, that's a little more unclear. Younger Vietnamese Americans have access to social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook to articulate their views younger Vietnamese Americans also have access to higher education opportunities than their parents, and as a result, tend to hold more like liberal views as opposed to older generations who tend to lean further right. But as this generation grows older, there's a little bit of ambiguity there because like younger Vietnamese Americans in the millennial and Gen Z generations could gravitate towards a more liberal track, but then also second generation Vietnamese Americans like Andy Ngo have explicitly demonstrated their conservative views. And so that could also lead towards like a political shift in the opposite direction. And so one important, I guess, just like framework that I tried to contextualize my research with was the COVID-19 pandemic and how the pandemic has escalated another wave of xenophobia in the United States, which also triggered an uptick of anti-Asian violence as a consequence. And so there are degrees of xenophobia and anti-Blackness in the Vietnamese community, and I think that in order to move forward and heal from these traumas that we've experienced, like during the war and as a result of our resettlement in the United States, we need to engage in like more dynamic conversations in our personal and professional discourse to move forward in this community. And lastly, I wanted to give a huge shout out to Dr. Joe Lowndes and Dr. Dong Vu from the Department of Political Science for their support and advice and guidance for this research. Thank you.
Thank you. Cool. That was awesome. I had never noticed the flag in that photo because I wasn't looking for it. So that's really cool that you did all this research. Any follow-up questions for Anna today? I do have a quick question about, you said at the very end that you think there needs to be more dynamic conversations that need to happen between generations, it sounded like, especially, as well as between different groups of people. But is there like an example of a type of conversation that you've experienced or you think should be happening on our UO campus right now?
I don't think like on our UO campus specifically, but I think I don't want to homogenize these experiences, but generally speaking, younger Vietnamese Americans are more liberal and older Vietnamese Americans are more conservative, and that leads to tensions within like family dynamics. And so I think just coming into conversations about current events like I guess just racial justice and other important issues that are impacting our community is like really important. And so just not hesitating to come into this like with a more open mind. Yes.
Cool. Yeah. Any other follow-up before we move on? Okay, thank you, Anna. So our second to last speaker is Maryam Moghaddami, a sophomore double majoring in cinema studies and psychology. Super cool combo. She's been working with Professor Ulrich Casimir from the Department of English and the Clark Honors College. Maryam's research is titled War and Peace, the Influence of World War II on Noir Films, Femme, Fatale. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay, so my presentation and research is looking at the relationship between the changes in society after the Second World War and the depiction of the femme fatale in noir films. Noir films is a genre of films that were popular during in the mid to late 40s and early 50s. So what you see in the 1940 society is that there was a shortage of men on the home front as they went off to fight during the Second World War. This resulted in a lot of women going out of the work, leaving the home and starting to find work, taking up traditionally male jobs. After the Second World War, however, after it ended, there was a drive by the government and labor unions to push women out of the workplace. There was propaganda that was urging women to give men their job backs. Similarly, after the Second World War, there was a rise in divorces. There's many different reasons for that, but ultimately women were blamed, and part of the reason they were blamed was there was seen to be a departure from traditional gender roles. For instance, when women left the home place, and as women after the Second World War were hesitant mostly to give up their jobs. Women are also accused of being money hungry as they were seen to gain a monetary advantage from getting alimony in divorce proceedings. This shift in gender dynamics was reflected in the film industry, in the noir films. Something to note about Hollywood at the time period, this was the period of the studio system. The studio system resulted in very few females holding high up positions in the film industry, meaning that the majority of films had a male director, producer, and screenwriter. The issue with this is that it often results in a male perspective being reflected in the films. So this societal need to, again, regain control over women, put women, quote unquote, back in their place was reflected in the film industry and in the depiction of the femme fatale. So some things you can see, the femme fatale can actually be analyzed as a caricature of American women. The femme fatale is a character who has economic incentives. She's, for instance, in Double Indemnity, one of the films that I analyzed, she is seeking to gain life insurance from her husband's death. In other films, she's stolen money from her partner, and Kathy Moffat, she has motives. She's also seen as being more sexually independent. She doesn't have a male interest frequently, and usually her partner or the male that she's connected with in the film, she uses him. He's a means to an end. She's not particularly interested in him. She's not looking to have a family. She's not looking to have children and settle down. The way essentially this kind of a character was demonized by having the femme fatale be a villain. Frequently in the noir film, the femme fatale is either the main villain or one of the villains. She's usually connected to the criminal side. So this demonization of the femme fatale essentially was to form of propaganda to discourage American women from taking that route. Additionally, the femme fatale is frequently compared to I'm going to call her the good girl, essentially the ideal American female. She's everything that the femme fatale is not. Out of the past, there's the role of Ann Miller, who, while Kathy Moffat is someone who kills people, who is not economically driven, essentially dominates the entire narrative, Ann Miller is essentially a very passive character. She's on the side. She's there to listen to the main protagonist, the main male protagonist's problem, and that's about it. Essentially, the narrative, the film regains control over this transgressive femme fatale character by essentially killing her off in the end. That's frequently the ending for the femme fatale. It happens in Double Indemnity and The Blue Dahlia, which is one of the other films that I discussed, in which there's a transgressive female character. And Out of the Past, or in some other films like Gilda, notably with Rita Hayworth, she's married off, and in this way, this transgressive character is brought back into the fold of the traditional American family. Another more indirect way that control is reestablished over the female character is through her hypersexualization. It has been argued by some scholars that in a phallocentric society, nudity or showing the female in a partially nude form is a form of regaining control because her nudity confirms her lack of a phallus, putting her in an inferior position to the male character who is usually dressed in most of these scenes. Similarly, the fragmentation of the female body, when her body is shown in different parts, she's not shown as a whole person. She's shown, there's a close-up of her face, there's a close-up of her feet, as it is in Double Indemnity, or there's a close-up of her chest, her eyes, or whatnot. She's shown as a collection of these attractive, appealing parts. She's not seen as a whole, and she's therefore less threatening to a male, and the male is able to regain control over her. So these films and the way that this femme fatale is shown is an extension of the societal need to regain control over the females after the Second World War, because they were seen as being transgressive, as going against the traditional societal norms. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any immediate follow-up questions? I do have a quick question as well. I love questions, but I'm just wondering kind of what drew you to this project.
So I was in a class with Professor Casimir. I'm a film studies major, so this was, again, it was an interesting topic to me. We've talked about how women are depicted in film before, particularly their sexualization and how that is a form of control. So that was something I had looked at previously. It is something I'm an honors college student, so it's something I'm planning to look at in my thesis. But in Professor Casimir's class, we were looking at noir films in particular, so it was something that I could connect to interests.
Cool. Is there any kind of thread that you've seen throughout film beyond film noir, from film noir to modern film, that is still kind of depicting women in the same way?
Yes, it is. And part of the reason is ultimately because the trend of having primarily male producers, male directors, male screenwriters continues. So this male perspective is continued. It's specific noir film, this is the specific genre I'm looking at, but the fact that there is a male director, a male screenwriter, a male producer results in this being a very androcentric perspective, which frequently means a female is objectified because that is how the male chooses to look at her. So yes, it does continue into film.
Well, thank you. I felt like that in my heart, but it's good to hear it validated too, and to see it's like a systemic issue as well. Great. Well, anything else before we move on to our final speaker? No, well, stay tuned. We will likely have some more questions for you at the end. So our last speaker of the day also worked with Professor Ulrich Casimir, and is one of their mentees exploring gender and identity also in noir film. Erica Waldron is a double major in psychology and sociology and is also a Clark Honors College student. Her research is titled Women in Film Noir, a reflection of post-war society evolving gender roles.
Awesome, thank you. Let me share my screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so yes, hello, my name's Erica, and my research centered on representations of female characters in film noir and how they reflect the evolving gender roles in post-World War II American society. And I won't go too in depth with the history given Maryam's awesome presentation, but for a little bit of historical context important to my research, over 6 million women stepped out of the domestic realm and entered the workforce between 1941 and 1945, with the number of employed wives basically doubling. However, this shifting of gender roles during the war was accompanied by backlash regarding women's newly carved place in society. Backlash emerged from both the government and society, with many desiring a return to pre-war tradition. During this time, some went as far to blame women, specifically working women, for societal issues such as rising rates of failed marriage and child delinquency, saying that they were basically just spurred on by additional income and a readiness to evade their responsibility for their children. Additionally, post-war disillusionment and a desire for harsh, realistic depictions of America free from the patriotic propaganda manifested in the classic noir films of the 40s and 50s that often embody a dark, fatalistic atmosphere filled with a variety of hard-boiled characters. Two common archetypal characters found within these films are, of course, the enigmatic femme fatale, but also the domestic femme attrapée. So with this history in mind for my project, I explored the question of how the noir films of the 40s and 50s interact with and reflect the evolving gender roles in post-war America. For my research, I utilized both a cinema studies and cultural studies framework to perform a close analysis of the 1947 film Out of the Past and the 1949 film The Reckless Moment, and the 1950 film Gun Crazy. So in general, my research yielded 3 main findings. The first of these findings is that depictions of femme fatales within noir films mirror the gender role defying actions taken by women following the war. These female characters were no longer confined to storylines in which they solely function as the mother or the male antihero's wife. Instead, the classic femme fatales bypassed traditional romance and domesticity for an ambition of money or freedom that drives the plot of the film. Their defined actions do tend to manifest at a more extreme level than in reality, as femme fatales usually do bring the leading man to ruin or his death in their fight against male domination. However, their actions still echo the manner in which women began to leave behind the constraints of domesticity and funnel into the traditionally male space of the workforce. Additionally, the tragic manner in which femme fatale storylines end corresponds to contemporaneous views regarding women who refuse to remain in the societal bounds of what was deemed appropriate. The femme fatale is not allowed to walk free after she oversteps these bounds. She's instead murdered, tortured, jailed, or at least married by the end of the film. This neutralization of the threat posed by femme fatales reflects the desire for women to settle back into their original pre-war domestic roles. My second finding is that portrayals of femme attrapées and their ability to survive further reflects the post-war reality of women and society's views on those who broke tradition. Instead of breaking free from convention, these characters are the loyal and docile women who fulfill the expected roles of partner, wife, and mother. The portrayal of femme attrapées is almost a direct mirror of women who conform to pre-war gender expectations. There's no exaggerated behaviors or challenges to masculinity. Instead, these women just embody the typical experience of operating within the domestic realm. And femme attrapées are permitted to survive noir narratives, unlike the femme fatales, because their actions are deemed acceptable when compared to what society at the time viewed as the ideal behavior of women. My final finding is that despite acting as a mirror for contemporaneous norms, classic noir films also offer criticism of traditional familial and gendered values through their on-film disparagement. Within noir, families are often portrayed as repressive, competitive, and hierarchical institutions in which the femme attrapées are the ones that bear the brunt of the oppression. Instead of being represented as content with their roles of stay-at-home nurturer, the mothers in film noir are instead depicted as overwhelmed or trapped by their maternal obligations. So in conclusion, my close examination of 3 noir films reveals that female film noir's characters' interactions with narratives of crime, love, and family reflect contemporaneous societal concerns about progressive gender roles. In general, the behavior of women engaging in the workforce are mirrored by the actions of the lethal femme fatale, and the manner in which femme fatales are punished in noir is reminiscent of the backlash against the real-life shift in gender roles. And in contrast, the femme attrapées engrossed in their familial duties reflect the return to tradition that many opted for post-war. And even though noir films depict the existence of femme attrapées and allow them to survive the film's finales, the genre does offer a denigrated depiction of this idealized lifestyle. Yeah, thanks for listening.
I keep forgetting to unmute myself, but thank you so much, Erica. Great. So that's Erica was our last speaker, and at this point, I mean, let's see if there's any direct questions for you to respond to. If not, we can open up the floor to everyone to just do kind of some continued questions for everyone, or individuals, or everyone at the same time. It's kind of up to how our crowd wants to go today. So any questions for Erica at this moment? If not, I just do have a question, which I'm sure Maryam can have some follow-up on as well. But I was wondering if there are any specific nuances that the noirs, that the black and white medium brings to this character as well, of the femme fatale. You don't have an answer. That's a weird question. So
that's not something that I've explored, but that is a really good question. I honestly, because noir is kind of rooted in like this tradition of German expressionism, like a specific style of art. And obviously black and white was the only medium available to them at the time. But that's a good question. I don't know if Maryam, if you have anything to add, but that would be a good future realm of exploration.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the only thing I could say is that particularly with the femme fatale, she generally lurks almost in the shadows. She's generally shown in scenes that are heavily shadowed. That, again, like Erica said, comes from German expressionism. It was used extensively in horror films. German expressionism were on the more scarier side. You can see a contrast in this generally. The good girl kind of character who's in comparison, she's more in nature scenes, she's shown in direct light. So I think the main difference is that in the black and white, the shadows are more visible than it would be in color. So I think, again, shadow person has traditionally been an evil, a more sinister kind of character. So I think that would be the only way.
Really good analysis, like just off the cuff there. That's awesome. Well, if there's no more questions for Erica specifically, I invite everyone to turn their cameras back on so we can see all of our wonderful panelists and open up the floor for general questions. I do want to say that we have a comment from Professor Lenz, who I believe worked with Anna, saying that all the presentations were excellent, incisive, theoretically interesting, and rich in research. So thank you so much for that comment. Before I keep questioning, because I have a million questions, do any of you have questions for each other? Yeah. I do have a question to maybe keep us like thinking. I'm not sure if everyone was aware, but again, the title of this poster session was called Influencers. And you were all kind of grouped together under this umbrella, which is a little bit ambiguous. But to me, hearing all of your research and your presentations, it sounds like that's really kind of an umbrella term talking about marginalized identity and how that influences not only historical context, but also our modern perception of society and equity. And I should say marginalized within, American society. So I was wondering if any of you have any elevator pitches, quick synopses of what can we learn in today's society with the research that you've done? Or like a hard ball.
I think just off the top of my head, maybe to be conscious of who's making, for instance, I'm talking about films, who's making the film, who's putting the film out there, because that's when you're not conscious of the fact that this is a male perspective and he has his own motives and he has his own ideas and his own what he wishes to do with his characters, you unintentionally align yourself with that perspective and you're not looking at it from an objective point of view, you're looking at it from his subjective point of view of the director or the creator of that film. So to be more conscious of, I guess, who's putting it out there and what's influencing the depictions of the characters in the film.
Sammy, your work talked about the feminist approach too. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking that I think language is really important when you're, especially in like media and like journalism, when you're that helps with the framing a lot. So maybe just to like, in regards to my research, be cautious of what language you use, because that can allude to a specific frame about how these female athletes might feel, or that'll frame them in a more of a negative way than a positive way. But yeah, I would say just to, for the future, look into like the language that's used, because that can affect how the public can view them or see them.
Yeah, Brenna, your work also touched really into like the media, like the 1960s media representation of some of these marginalized identities within Spain itself. Was there any kind of common theme that you can think of that ties your research with our female representation presentations? It doesn't have to be about gender.
Okay, I will say gender was a very small part of my research because out of the letters I had access to, there was only one female author. I noticed that her letter had a couple things that were pretty distinctly different from the male authors I read. For example, she talked about her children and their education, a concern that none of the male authors expressed. So I think it was interesting to look at perhaps how her concerns would differ from her male counterparts, especially since it seemed from her letters that she wasn't employed in the agricultural sector like her husband. But I think also just generally as a point of sort of influence and what these stories can tell us about our connection to today's culture, it's really important to remember that America is a country that's essentially built on immigrants. So I think it's important to just remember to include these types of voices and to include accounts from people who have come here and what that experience is like, because that's kind of one of the things.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Does anyone else have an answer? I mean, I know Anna, I already grilled you a little bit on like kind of like takeaway for modern society, but anything else to add?
Yeah, I don't think I characterize like the Vietnamese American conservatism, the conservative movement as one that's like marginalized. But like Brenna said, I think that the immigration experience is something that's really important to kind of interrogate and address because especially for Vietnamese refugees who fled their homeland in such like an abrupt fashion, I guess. They carry a lot of experiences of war trauma that impact how they view the world and their place in it. And so I think trying to understand the nuances of Vietnamese American conservatism or liberalism is really important to try to like bridge these supposed like barriers that exist between generations of Vietnamese Americans.
Yeah, thank you for calling me out on the marginalized communities too. That's totally like subjective versus objective terminology. So thank you for pointing that out and yeah, highlighting the intergenerational trauma that goes into a lot of these movements today. Great. Any questions? I'm going to ask it a millionth time. Yes, Brenna.
I actually have a question for Sammy. I thought your presentation was a really fascinating subject. As someone who's played sports my whole life, I know I've encountered a lot of, I guess, I don't know about framing, but like people thinking of me a certain way because I'm an athlete, because I'm like tall. And so I'm wondering if you found within your research on framing any sort of contrast between the way powerful female athletes, like especially Serena Williams, tend to be portrayed as sort of masculine versus then their experience of pregnancy, which is of course pretty inherently feminine. I wonder if you found any contrast there, or if you looked at that at all.
Yeah, specifically with Serena or with all the athletes, I looked at like only like a 3-year time span. So from like those articles that I read from Serena, a lot of she's before framing, I think before she was pregnant, it was very focused on like her physical aspects and her strength and like what she has to like offer, I guess. And like post pregnancy, she actually lost 2 of the matches after she had major complications when she almost like died. I'm not sure if everyone knows that, but it was obviously it would be difficult to come back from something like that. And a lot of the frames were like a rusty return or the headlines, I should say, not frames, but a lot of them were kind of criticizing her coming back and like not being able to win. So I think a lot of the post pregnancy with Serena is more about how will she come back from this, which is I think kind of has like a negative connotation because, but yeah, that's basically kind of what I've summarized or found through Serena specifically.
Did Sammy, this is for you directly, but I think it impacts everyone's actually because all of these are very like timely in the sense that they're related to something that's recently gotten a lot of attention in the past decade as far as a social movement and or a political leaning that people are analyzing right now. So with your work, did you see a shift at any point in interviews from like 10 years ago? I don't know how old everyone's kids are, to be honest, but from when they had their first kid to their second kid, if that was an option, was it like more defensive at one point? Did it become more like, hey, this is me, stop asking me these questions?
Yeah, I think through time, ones I looked at for Joy Fawcett specifically, she was on the women's national soccer team. She was like kind of the original soccer mom, as they called her. So from her perspective, she got a lot of criticism for training while like during her pregnancy, and she returned really quickly. So about like 2 weeks after she had her child, she returned. So a bunch of the articles were headlined like breathtaking return, or like something that's like shocking, kind of what I talked about earlier, like that stereotypical like super mom type frame. So I guess what's kind of changed is that like medical aspect about how it's safe for these women to train during pregnancy. And I think that that obviously took some learning throughout like 10 years of time because people were very critical, but like only these women know their bodies and what they can do. So yeah, that's kind of what I found. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, totally. Does anyone else see kind of like some trends of change in the approach to how people research and analyze these topics that you've chosen? I know, Brenna, yours was like a pretty nuanced. Not many people have looked into this, it sounded like previously. So maybe you have some insight, but I know all of our topics, there's been time, well, Anna, your topic's pretty fresh, but there's still time to like see them develop further. So have you seen any change?
For my topic personally, I think the topic is quite new. The access to the archive is quite new, so I haven't seen throughout the literature that I looked at while I was doing my research a ton of change, but I definitely did notice that while data that I looked at tend to explore this migratory wave in terms of like numbers, in terms of where did migrants go, where did they work, what kind of work did they do. Now with the publications literature I used and also with looking at these letters, it's becoming more of a looking at social histories and looking at like what the experience was rather than in terms of data.
Great. Well, again, I just want to open the floor up to anyone else before we close things out. Okay, one last question for everyone that I always ask at these events because it's my favorite time of year, but I do want to ask everyone, you know, why this topic and why the undergraduate research symposium? I'm just going to do popcorn style. I saw Maryam smile, so I'm going to ask you if you have any answer.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I mentioned previously it was a topic that I was interested in. I felt like the symposium gave me more of a motivation to look into it more deeply that I wouldn't have had maybe if I wasn't doing it for a reason, I guess. I mean, and it also, I mean, gives an opportunity to talk about an issue that is ongoing in the film industry, the representation of women and the underrepresentation of women within the film industry itself.
Erica? Oh, sorry. Go for it.
To speak to this question, I would say that this research topic really inspired me because I think working with old documents is a passion of mine, trying to figure out the handwriting and the language and the nuance of all that. That's like a passion project that I like to get into. But then once I actually got into it, I realized that there was a whole wealth of knowledge here that just hadn't been explored. So that's why I'm trying to share this. Like, that's why I'm presenting here, because particularly in English, there's very little scholarship working with these letters. So I just am trying to kind of get the word out there about this source.
I can go now, I guess. I was in the same, not the same term, but the same class as Maryam was in. It was just a film noir cinema studies class. And I noticed we also read a lot of not film noir, but noir literature. And out of all of the books and short stories we read, there was a single female author. So that just got me thinking about women in relation to film noir, and I am a sociology major, and that same term I was also taking the sociology of gender, so I was just kind of in the mood of thinking about gender, and it's always just really interesting to see the way that women are portrayed in films, especially in one that when you think about film noir, I feel like a lot of people think about like the male anti-hero and just kind of like the male perspective, so it was really interesting to be able to take a look at it from like a gender perspective, especially in relation to the war.
Thank you.
I can go next. So specifically for, I chose this topic because Last year I was part of this track class, and we covered, obviously it was remote, so a lot of people came to our Zoom classes and were interviews. And this one woman came, her name was Sally Bergeson, and she is the owner of this athletic apparel company called WWII, and it's woman-owned, woman-led, and she kind of led the conversation about maternity protections for female athletes. Because with specific companies like Nike, a story came out in 2019 about Alicia Montano, and she got her contract reduced, but then Nike continued to like advertise her as like the pregnant runner, even though she wasn't getting paid for what she was doing for them. And it was kind of just that like back and forth of, oh, she's doing all this for you, but you're not going to provide her protections, or for this company that she's like representing and winning at all of these like events and track meets. So I thought it would be really interesting to look at how the media covers them, and specific like themes that would occur through those stories that I read. But specifically for the undergraduate research symposium, my advisor brought it up to me and said that I should submit it, and it kept me motivated, I think, throughout the term to just keep going with it instead of just like kind of taking my time with it. But yeah.
And I think that for me, like the rise of Vietnamese American conservatism is really interesting because growing up, this was a worldview that I was aware of but didn't really understand. And I think that coming from like a household of refugees, it was really jarring for me to see like the South Vietnamese flag being waved at the Capitol insurrection. And I was trying to like process how I felt about that. And this opportunity came up for me to investigate this political and cultural phenomenon in greater depth. And so um, I, I think that although my findings like show that there is a lot to unpack here with like the political and cultural underpinnings of Vietnamese American conservatism, there still is a lot that has yet to be explored. And so I'm looking forward to kind of learning more about this specific experience and how it can impact the Vietnamese American community like in the future, I guess.
Great, thank you so much. And that's kind of a perfect note to end on, because I just want to encourage everyone to continue on with your great work. You've put in so much work already, and you've gotten a taste for research, and now you know that no one bites at these panels. So I hope this was a good time. I really want to thank all of you for bringing such diverse experiences and research to this group, educating me and our attendees. For our attendees, I just want to say thank you to all the faculty who joined us today, but also to all of the attendees who have been supporting our researchers throughout the term and throughout the year. I know it's been a weird year. So again, thank you. And I also want to put out there that this is week 9 now? So you chose to do this with finals right around the corner. And the fact that you did that just shows your dedication to academics and your excellence as undergraduate students. So thank you so much. If there's nothing else, I can let everyone go though. Bye guys.
Thank you.
Hi, Kenlei. That seemed to go great.